Good evening and welcome to the special meeting of the City Council of the City of Cotati on Tuesday, May 19th, 2015. It is 7 o'clock, and so we will call the meeting to order. Going down my list, it looks like we're going to open up to public comment in the beginning. So pursuant to California Government Code Section 54.3 Sub A, members of the public wishing to address the council may do so at the beginning of the special meeting, and such comments will be limited to the special meeting topics. Do we have anybody present who would like to make a public comment? Okay, seeing none, I will close public comment. And we'll move on to the consent calendar. We have consent calendar item 3.1, designation of authorized representatives to examine sales, use, and transaction tax records.
Move to approve.
Second.
All right, I have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, may the record reflect that is a 5-0 vote in favor of the consent calendar item. Now we'll move on to public hearing for the 2014-2022 housing element update. And for that, I will turn to our Community Development Director, Vicki Parker.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and good evening, council members. The item before you this evening is, as you said, an update of the city's housing element, and tonight there are actually two actions that we're recommending the council do. The first one being to adopt a resolution amending the city's general plan and actually adopting the housing element. And the second one is the introduction of an ordinance making a number of amendments to our land use code or the municipal code to effectuate some changes that the State Housing and Community Development Department has asked us to make. So we'll go through those in some detail, or as much detail as you'd like to tonight. Just briefly, as I think you know, we updated our housing element fairly recently at the beginning or toward maybe the first third of our general plan process, and we actually adopted the 2009 to 2014 housing element in 2012. So that enabled us to do a very focused amendment for this cycle, and this cycle is the 2014 to 2022. So it's now an 8-year cycle as opposed to the previous 5-year cycle, and the reason for that was some legislation that passed, oh gosh, testing my memory, I want to say 2010, that aligned housing elements with transportation plans, and the regional transportation plans are on a 4-year cycle. So now instead of doing this odd 5-year cycle of housing, we're now doing an 8-year cycle, which aligns with 2 regional transportation plan cycles. So that's the reason for the new time period. And the primary edits or updates that we did were focused on our new share of our regional housing needs allocation and to incorporate the 2010 census data, which wasn't all available to us when we did our last housing element update, to address changes in state law. And then secondly, these land use code amendments that we had promised to make when we adopted our 2009 element. So just briefly, I'll explain a little bit about the color coding that is in the element for you. The changes that are shown in yellow were the first changes that were made to element, and then through discussions with State Housing and Community Development as well as our public workshop and our Planning Commission hearing, some additional changes were made or revisions were made, and those are color coded in blue. And then we have just very minor or I should say very narrowly focused amendments that were done after the Planning Commission, and those are in green, and we can go into those in more detail if you'd like, since the Planning Commission did not see those. Our goal is to adopt the housing element tonight as well as these ordinance amendments, and that would be our recommendation. But I'm going to hand it over really quickly to Ben Ritchie, and he's going to, of De Novo, whom I know you know very well, and Ben will run us through some of the high points and requirements as well as the middle of the process that we're in.
All right, thank you, Vicki. Good evening, Mayor, Council members. Ben Ritchie, Principal at De Novo Planning Group. I will be very concise, so I'm happy to answer any questions if you'd like me to expand upon anything. Vicki touched on most of what I was going to go over. So, as she mentioned, our two recommended actions are adopting the actual housing element and then the resolution to adopt amendments to the city's land use code. The overall purpose of the housing element is to identify housing needs, including those of special populations, identify any constraints to housing, identify resources, including land available for housing. This is one of the major things the state looks at. Cotati is in a good position where you don't have to rezone any land. So I think as the council's aware, the housing element doesn't require the city to get into the business of constructing housing. You need to demonstrate that you can facilitate and accommodate your regional fair share. And what the state usually looks at is, do you have adequate vacant or underdeveloped multifamily zoned parcels where additional affordable type housing could be located? And on the heels of your general plan update, you have adequate sites to meet your allocation. So some communities find themselves in a position where they have to rezone land. Maybe that's taking commercial and sticking it into high-density residential zones. No rezones at all for Cotati as part of your housing element update. The element includes a review of the effectiveness of your current housing element. So as Vicki mentioned, the series of land use code revisions were some of the primary meat and potatoes that the state was looking to have implemented from the previous element, and so adopting these land use code revisions will go a long way towards helping to ensure that the state certifies your updated element that we have before you tonight. And overall, the housing element sets forth your strategy for addressing housing needs, including new construction, rehabilitation, and special needs housing for all income levels. Neat little flow chart. It's an arrow. We're moving our way through it. So we began the process by updating data and reviewing your existing housing element. So again, the things highlighted yellow where we had more current building permit data and more updated census data, so just sort of the demographic type data and building trends. We prepared the draft housing element. It was not a significant change from your previous one. 2012 is pretty darn recent to have adopted your last housing element, and so we tried to do a targeted update and not just throw the old one out and redo it for the sake of redoing it, being as how it's so recent. It was sent to the state for review. Vicki and I had a couple conference calls with the state reviewer. Having sat in on a number of these, the review went about as well as it possibly can, i.e. they didn't have a whole lot of substantive comments, and the state's comments were largely focused on asking us to provide some additional explanation for how programs are working locally or expand upon how the parking standards work near the downtown, things of that nature. They had a couple of targeted requests related to policies. They were exceptionally minor, and mostly they were for clarifications on the implementation time frame. And the state's comments really did not result in any substantive policy or program changes, and they really didn't try and push you in a new direction. It was, I think that they feel absolutely compelled to comment on every document they ever get, and they can't ever let one come through and say, yeah, it looks good, no changes, but this is about as close to that message as you'll find. So the state's review was, I'll call it light and friendly as far as getting this through, and I really have to credit Vicki with most of that. She was very accommodating and excellent at explaining how programs are implemented locally, so you could hear them on the phone wanting to nudge the city towards making some changes, and then Vicki was able to sort of walk them through how it's working and why that's okay, and they relented on most fronts. So we're now here at adoption hearings, and assuming adoption goes through tonight, we'll turn right around this week and send the adopted housing element back to the state, and they will issue their certification letter. Assuming the council doesn't direct us to make significant or substantive changes to the housing element before you, it should be just a formality as far as the state certifying it, because they've already issued a letter saying the draft in its current form meets the state's legal requirements. So if we don't tinker with it too much, the certification should really just be a formality. So one of the key components of your housing element is the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, the RHNA. And you've probably seen us go over this before, but essentially the state hands down an allocation of units to the regional planning agencies. So in Cotati's case, that's ABAG. So ABAG gets an allocation of 187,990 units, and all of the member jurisdictions within ABAG's area are given their allocation. So Cotati's total allocation is 137 units. And again, the city's not required to construct these. They're divided among different income levels, the very low, extremely low, low, moderate, and above moderate. Those income levels are based on the median incomes within the county. So it's a formula. So the income levels in Cotati are dictated by the county's median income. And the allocation is doled out based on zoning, the availability of sites, and the availability of resources and services. It tries to address an over and under concentration of lower income housing units throughout the region, so certain communities aren't overly burdened, and it tries to keep other communities that would like to be exempt from providing affordable housing from not being exempt. We won't name names. Housing units are distributed among the various income groups, and as I mentioned several times, the city, again, is not required to build any units, but must take actions to facilitate development. So you remove impediments and show how you have a plan in place that the housing could come here. But again, it remains primarily private sector and market driven. Being as how we were on the heels of the general plan update, we definitely factored in and considered a lot of the public input we got during the general plan update process, and we also held a separate housing workshop open to the community on April 15th. So a quick snapshot on some of the community input that we received: the need for senior housing, transitional supportive housing, very low income housing, housing affordable for large families, addressing issues related to homelessness, providing housing in proximity to transportation and services, encouraging more housing in the downtown specific plan area, and developing regional partnerships to assist special needs groups. So as I mentioned, the changes to your current 2012 housing element were very minor. So updated census data, recent development trends. We updated the implementation timeframes for a number of programs. You know, your last draft said implement by 2013 or 2014, so obviously the dates needed to be updated. A number of the programs that were in your last housing element are being reflected. You know, it might have been a program that says amend the land use code to do X, Y, Z. Well, most of those targeted updates are part of your land use code revisions in your packet today. So a lot of the key programs from your last housing element will be implemented tonight, presumably. And since you had the same team of Beth and I that did your last housing element plus your general plan plus this housing element, we made sure that it was internally consistent with the general plan update that you just adopted. So there's nothing in this housing element. It's not the tail wagging the dog. We don't have to go back and tinker with the general plan that you just spent so much time and energy updating. They're all internally consistent with each other. I think Vicki will go over the land use code revisions in greater detail. Basically, they're to bring your land use code into compliance with recent changes to state law. So changes related to inclusionary housing requirements, allowances for farm worker and employee housing, defining the term family as it's applied under state housing law, streamlining the process for reasonable accommodation for persons with a disability, revised provisions for emergency shelters and transitional housing. And I'll specify emergency shelters are not where you go if there's a flood, but more where you would go if you were at risk of becoming homeless. So it's an often misconstrued term, but it's not a community gathering place in case of natural disaster. Increasing the bonuses available to applicants providing affordable and senior housing, condo conversion requirements, and size standards for second dwelling units. We were at Planning Commission a couple of weeks ago. I want to say it was May 4th. Thank you. I was going to say the 5th, May 4th. In terms of the housing element itself, the Planning Commission revisions were extremely minor. They had some minor revisions to the inclusionary ordinance language in the land use code revisions, which dictated some very minor revisions to Program 2-2. So essentially, we revised the housing element to reflect the direction they gave on the land use code as far as the allocation of units among income groups for the inclusionary ordinance. And then, as I mentioned previously, the state HCD revisions were extremely minor, so clarifications on implementation timeframes. They asked for one new program after we talked to Planning Commission about monitoring use permits for multifamily development. So just to make, rather than having you change your land use code, they just wanted to make sure that your code as crafted was not going to be an impediment to multifamily development. And so they asked for a program that you monitor to make sure that you're not having applicants that come in and realize that the code requirements are an impediment, and then they go away and projects are dying as a result of your onerous code. We don't anticipate it being a problem, and Vicki couldn't think of any project that fell into that category of going away for lack of ability to comply with your land use code, but made the state feel good to have this new program in there, so we figured the best to give them the program. And then, as I mentioned, there was an expanded discussion of existing city programs and the effectiveness of the previous housing element. So those were really just the new content. It was mostly just giving them a little more background explanation on things. And that's the extent of my presentation, so I'm happy to answer any questions, and we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you. So want to go down the line and see if we have questions for our staff. Councilmember Delasso.
All right. I think it was section H3, but I didn't write it down in my notes here. But my question has to do with homelessness. And I know it's addressed in here, but this plan addresses, you know, the ability, the need to build structures. And I know that a number of months ago, and it's never, the council's never taken this up, but a number of months ago, a couple of groups that were here, Catholic Charities, and another group about, you know, would the city ever consider another alternative? And so I'm trying to figure out, the alternative I think they were discussing was more of like, you know, a parking lot. And somebody who may be homeless but owns a vehicle, they live and sleep in their vehicle, would we consider, and again, I want to re-emphasize, we've not addressed this as a group. How does this plan, I couldn't see how it was addressing that little niche there.
Yes, you're accurate that this document mostly addresses the development of housing, because it's meant to remove constraints to development. So we actually had representatives from the Homeless Coalition here on our meeting on April 15th, and we talked a bit about that. And what we did do in response that's in the document now is there was a lot of discussion at that meeting about approaching the homelessness issue from a program perspective, and how the document could, so less of a development perspective and more of a larger citywide programming type approach. So what we did was refine we added the element used to say the commercial East Cotati zone or commercial Gravenstein, and we changed that or to an and to allow facilities to be built in both of those zones if that were to happen. And then there was a lot of discussion at that meeting about a model that has been operating in Marin County of using churches and other quasi-public facilities on a temporary basis for emergency housing. So recognizing that most of our churches or larger meeting facilities are in the DSP, we added language to the element that would allow that to happen in existing facilities in the downtown specific plan.
Okay, so so it sounds like then there's definitely some flexibility and interpretation that could go on in there, which is great. And I'm not trying to be pre-decisional. I'm just, at some point that may come back to us, and you know, we will be making some kind of a decision at some point down the road, and there's a multitude of factors and directions this could go, so that's great. And kind of along the same, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I realized I didn't fully answer your question. So the part about whether something happens in a parking lot or whether it happens on the street, like removing the 72-hour parking requirement or any of those possibilities that are being talked about with the homeless advocates regionally, they wouldn't reside in here because they're different parts of the municipal code. So this doesn't prevent it from taking a variety of shapes that the council might want to direct.
Sure, and that makes perfect sense because it is the housing element, but I didn't know, I couldn't quite find the right spot, but thank you for that. But along those same lines, another issue that will eventually be coming to us will be the multi-unit dwellings and smoking ordinance. Again, don't know, we've not discussed this, it's not come to us yet. Is there some element of, I'm not sure what the word is I'm looking for, healthy living, but I can't think of what I'm looking for, but something that may not, in a multi-unit dwelling, that may not impede on others. And smoking is an example. I mean, there could be other things out there, but I couldn't quite find something that fit there, and I may have missed it very easily, so I don't know if you have an answer for that.
I think it's similar in that because this is focused on, it's similar to the homeless question in that because this focuses mostly on removing impediments to development, those kind of operational pieces that might happen in multifamily could happen outside. There's nothing in this element that would prevent future regulations. So far, smoking as a population hasn't been defined, smokers as a population hasn't been defined, or non-smokers for that matter, defined as any class that has special status under federal or state law. So these regulations don't impact them in that way.
Right, and it just becomes more of a policy regulation issue, which is not, this is much more narrow focus, so I get that. Okay, I just want to make sure there were no impediments built into this process. That's what I really wanted to find out.
And the one thing I would add is I'll echo that there are no impediments in this that would preclude future smoking ordinances or regulations, and the community health and wellness element of your recently adopted general plan update has language that will, I would anticipate the council might someday move in a direction to have stricter regulations on smoking rather than necessarily going the other direction, and you have supportive language in your community health and wellness that will give you the policy footing to build off of to go in that direction if the council so chooses.
All right, thank you.
All right, Councilmember Harvey.
Thank you for asking that question, John. I was going to ask about that, too. On page 14, Vicki, there's a section on limitations on occupancy, and I was a little confused by that language and the inclusions and getting credit for different ones. Could you, explain that better for me?
Yes, this actually came up at Planning Commission too. This is old, the paragraph is old language, and one of the planning commissioners was observing how it didn't make, he wasn't able to interpret what it really meant, and so we had a bit of a discussion about it. Generally, it's meant to incentivize developers of multifamily housing to provide more units at the lower end of the affordability spectrum, so you can exchange, one moderate income unit for two low income units and one low income for two very low income. So this highlighted portion was our attempt to sort of clarify that a little bit better.
Okay, thank you. Then on page 45, it's talking kind of about the parking and things like that. And I was wondering, by lowering the parking on these things, do we really understand what those impacts might be? I mean, parking is one of those things that people tend to come talk to us about, so I was interested in knowing more about that.
Sure. Yeah, this was part of our conversation with HCD where we told them we weren't ready to commit to those parking limits at this point, and that's why it's in there as a future program, that we would be happy to take it through a public process, and some of our areas might very well benefit from a lower parking standard, say the downtown specific plan area maybe. But these numbers only apply to properties that are zoned NU. So quite honestly, there aren't that many of them. They're primarily along East Cotati, where there's a pretty good transportation network with bus services, et cetera. So we thought it was worth looking into in the future to see if our transportation services got to a good point where we could reduce them.
So it doesn't really commit us, it's really saying in the future, if it looks like it would work for us, then...
That we will take it through, yes, the process to investigate it.
Okay. On page 59, there's tables that talk about, percentages of households and all that stuff. Do you think some of that is driven by the fact of the recession? Did that stuff kind of change around a little bit because the mix in the city may have changed?
I definitely think our average household size got a little bit bigger. It was 2.4, and now it's increased by 1/10. So or 5/100ths. But yes, our average household size has gotten slightly larger. In the homeless counts that were done countywide on January 1st, we had, I think, 16 homeless people, 3 of those unsheltered, only 3 of those unsheltered. So that tells me it's people staying with friends or extended family, sleeping on couches, that kind of thing. So whether all those got counted as homeless or some of them got counted in as household size, I do think there's definitely what we see in the census is a little bit of it's being a little harder to make ends meet.
Yeah. I almost feel that that's the same, too, on the tenure, because I think that there were, a whole lot of houses that went either into foreclosure or short sale, and that kind of would tend to make that tenure really kind of change because of that. So we may at some point see that, come back up to a more normal range. I think we're, really now just seeing what's the new normal.
Yes, I agree. I was just reading earlier in the week that the high point of short sales and foreclosures was in 2013, and we've been rebounding since then. So we've dropped from maybe 8 and 9% down to 6 and 7%.
And one more. On the next page, when it talks about the incomes, are we impacted by these incomes because of our influx of college students that may tend to not have income? Does that, it does, okay.
Yeah, I believe it does. It's hard always to pull those out because some college students are counted at their homes, and some are counted at their place of residence. So I think in every community they struggle with trying to figure exactly what impact there is to their demographic information of that number. But I definitely would think that we've absorbed that some of those are reflected in our median incomes.
Okay. That's all my questions.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Lehman.
Thank you, Mayor Skillman. First of all, I'm going to compliment Mr. Ritchie from De Novo. Thank you again for, once again, very difficult subject matter to present. It's clear, concise. I don't think you could do it much better. So thank you again for your work in this. That's a pleasure. And you don't hear that often about land use things, that it's a pleasure. So enjoy that. I had a more general question, and I want to thank my colleague, particularly Councilmember Harvey, for bringing up some of the concerns with parking and some of the neighborhood urban areas, and some of those, just the general relaxation, potential relaxation of various permit issues in general, were things that I noted. Then I saw the designation of the neighborhood, and I thought, well, maybe this is appropriate here. So I had an open mind on that. So in general, I wanted to ask, first off, the neighborhood urban, that essentially is the same as when we look at our zoning map here, is the high-density residential, right, 15 units per acre.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. So as I look at that map, and you don't really need to look at it, but if anybody wants to, it's on page 151. And I wanted to ask a general question about feathering. As I looked at the variety of uses, for the most part, actually, the districts largely flow from one use to another rather well, as you'd want. And it's a concern for me, just on local neighborhood projects. We've seen problems when things don't feather well, when you abruptly go from one use to another. And I'll use the perfect example of Olaf Street. I think is an example of perhaps where that's jarring, and is, although it may have done some goals of building, bringing in some lower-cost housing, or that it's been more problematic overall, I think, and less of an ideal way to go. So my question, just in general, as we go forward implementing this in the next few years, what are the tools we have in here at some of these boundary places where we might run into that again, where we'll have something that seems appropriate perhaps for the zoning area, but is right next to something that's a little different, it's a little jarring. What tools do I have to make sure that we have appropriate feathering and transitioning from one use to another where there's a little difference between the two and they butt up to each other?
Yeah, I think that's a logical question, and when you look at the removal of the use permit, but honestly, I'm not sure it was the greatest tool to address those issues, because use permits are, as their name suggests, about the use. And so if you have something that's zoned multifamily and there's a multifamily development project being applied or being applied for, you fundamentally want to handle any potential nuisance issues through design, if possible, and then through your municipal code as just a code enforcement type of monitoring, because the use permit is set up to address things like hours of operation or waste disposal or noise or those things that may change from use to use.
So if the use is appropriate, it wouldn't be a tool to negotiate use, essentially.
Right. And it's not unusual that jurisdictions might have that, which is why it's one of the first things that HCD looks at to remove, because they've seen it happen over and over. In their minds, it adds another level of discretion to the process that they're uncomfortable with. For us, any new construction goes through design review, which is at least 2 public hearings, and a third, if there's a map involved, it comes on to the council. But for us, adding the use permit really doesn't give us anything additional. So we're a little bit harder on the design pieces to ensure the compatibility, but limiting hours or limiting activity areas are things we can do through the design process and not necessarily a use permit. And I've worked in other jurisdictions, where there is no use permit requirement for that type, for multifamily in a multifamily zone.
Good. Well, I just wanted to ask you to speak on that, because obviously it's a problem we've seen in the past. Somebody at some point in the past didn't handle it as well. I wanted to make sure that we're poised to be able to deal with it. And you feel, as planning director, we have appropriate tools both in the design review process, that there's checkpoints that are built into that can't be essentially raced past or bypassed with any ease, and the Muni Code as well is enough to back that up?
I do. We try in the design review process to certainly look at all of those on a staff level, but to, for any new development, have those compatibility discussions, which we've had several of them at Planning Commission, which have been really instructive, with mixed-use development, for example, because those are still sort of evolving and we're learning all the time about what is working and not working. So again, we're learning all the time, but the use permit wouldn't give us necessarily any new tools to work with.
So we have basically the best tools available are there, they're the ones we should use, and protects us as much as possible.
I believe we do. Our municipal code is pretty strong about nuisance impacts on neighboring properties.
Good. Thank you.
Vice Mayor Moore.
And of course, we also have that party ordinance. That helps. There was a couple of things that struck me about this document. I was not on the council in 2012 when this was adopted, so in going through this, some of it struck me as fascinating reading, for lack of a better term. And I think that there's a lot of thought and effort put into it. I thought it was a nice job that was done on there, and a lot of research. There seemed to me, and maybe it was my comprehension of the document, that there were some contradictions in some of the things that we were looking at there. And this is probably more of a conceptual on this. In the very beginning of the document, the housing element that we're looking to amend or to adopt, that was from 2012, I think one of the initial statements on one of the very first pages on there indicated that population was increasing in California. And then through the document, we've got some references to a decrease in our potential inclusionary housing from maybe a 20% to a 15%. And I'm thinking, well, is it me or is that a contradiction? I mean, could you clarify that for me?
Sure. The primary reason for reduction in inclusionary housing requirements is that it can have unintended consequences when the inclusionary housing requirements are too high. And so if you have very high onerous inclusionary housing requirements that are disproportionate to neighboring jurisdictions or disproportionate to the state mandated minimums, what you end up with is a disincentive for development at the local area, because inclusionary housing at the end of the day costs applicants and developers some money. And so a community that wants to have as much inclusionary housing as possible wouldn't necessarily set their requirements as a higher and higher percentage, because you're suddenly dissuading development from occurring. And so by calibrating it more towards the regional averages and complementary or consistent with what you're seeing in neighboring jurisdictions, it puts the city on a more equal footing as far as attracting more market rate development, some of which may very well be affordable to lower income groups at its market rate nature. So if you're building market rate studios, they don't necessarily have to have price manipulations to be affordable to some income groups for smaller families. But overly onerous inclusionary housing requirements are a disincentive to development and can have the unintended consequence of actually resulting in fewer affordable units.
There are some things that I have concerns with in addressing the percentages of the inclusionary housing, and it struck me when Councilman Harvey was talking about that. There are components that address lower income, and some of those may be attributable to college students. That might bring some of those numbers down. But we also have a higher rental market, a less tenure. Less tenure being because maybe the cost of housing is pretty high in the greater Bay Area, Cotati included in that. So there's the concern, if you have a higher cost of housing all around and a lower element of inclusionary housing, you're creating a segmented market for that. So for me, I don't know if there's such an impediment at the existing 20% for the inclusionary housing that we're not going to have development here at Cotati. We have some projects ongoing now that are under the 20% or being considered at that level. I think the proponents of those particular projects would like 5% inclusionary housing, so I don't know that dropping to 15 is going to be an impediment to any development coming into town, and I don't know that that's something that's mandated from the state community housing.
It's not mandated from the
Suggested,
state.
maybe.
yeah, it's within our purview. I will say that this applies only to projects that aren't requiring a legislative action from the council, so it would apply to projects that were being built, say residential projects being built on residentially zoned property. If there was a general plan amendment or a zone change or a specific plan amendment required, those are all negotiable in terms of the affordability percentage. So there's room there for negotiation. It also doesn't preclude a developer from asking for a density bonus through the state program. So they could ask for concessions from the city in terms of setbacks or height or any of the development standards that we have, parking, in order to increase their density. So there are still tools available for increasing the density in any given development project. I will say, though, that across the board, we get a lot of, especially with multifamily development, we get a lot of investors who would buy property in Cotati, or they might buy property in Rohnert Park, or they might buy property in Petaluma, and those things do impact their decision-making. And that's why we decided to lower it, is that, as Ben said, if you put it too high, it means that they'll take their investment and they'll put it somewhere else, because in that jurisdiction, it's only 15%. So while it doesn't decrease it potentially by that 5%, it at least gets us the 15%. So that was our logic.
Okay. A couple of the other issues that were interesting to me was when we talked, you just touched on a little bit, and the bonuses. And the bonuses would be something that would allow for a particular variance in the zoning if they were to have a greater percentage of inclusionary housing.
Yes, that's accurate. It's a sliding scale of increasing percentage of density as it aligns to a greater number of concessions. So could be a 10% increase in density for 2 concessions, or a 15-20% for 3 concessions. I don't remember I'm making up those numbers,
Right.
but that's the basic idea.
Well, that's the concept of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Those were just some of my concerns and questions and clarifying on that. Overall, I thought it was a pretty good plan.
All right, thank you. One of the benefits of going last is that all of my questions have been asked already. So I want to echo as well, thank you for the hard work behind this. I think it's been very clearly and thoroughly explained, so thank you very much for all of the work behind that. And I'll bring it back to the council.
I'm sorry, Madam Mayor, if I could, I failed to point out to you that we had some organizational edits. I had some language that was inappropriate in my ordinance that our city attorney caught for me, and so the revised edition is on the dais for you, and the changes are highlighted in yellow.
Thank you. Yes, I think we all have that, so perfect.
And if I, just one last question too for staff. So you did say you were looking for 2 separate motions here, right, tonight?
Yes, thank you.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and start with the motions, and we'll see if there's any further discussion, I guess. So I would like to move to adopt a resolution amending the general plan to update the housing element.
Second.
All right, I have a motion and a second. All those in favor, say aye. 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 Oh, yes.
Just a quick question for procedure. Should that say with revisions? Because what's in here is a little different than what's on the dais. So we're good? Never mind.
Okay, with that clarification, I have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? May the record reflect it's a 5-0 vote in favor of adoption of the resolution.
And since I created the problems the first time around, I'll do the duty of reading this really long one. And let's see if I can... I move we introduced an ordinance including revisions amending Cotati Municipal Code Chapters 17.24 titled Zoning District Development Standards,
Bless you. Bless you.
17.31 titled Affordable Housing Requirements, 17.32 titled Density Bonuses, 17.42 titled Standards for Specific Land Uses, 17.62 titled Permit Revision, Review and Decisions, 17.90 titled Definitions, and 17.74 titled Additional Subdivision Procedures, and adding Chapter 17.68 titled Reasonable Accommodation.
Second?
All right, I have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? May the record reflect that's a 5-0 vote in favor of introducing all of the listed ordinances as revised.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for all the work behind it.
Thank you very much.
And since we have touched on all of our items, I will go ahead and adjourn this meeting at 7:45. Thank you.